In the fall of 1986, Frank Bowen, along with his two daughters, Tina, who was 15, and Karen, who was 9, experienced a terrible loss. Frank's wife and the girls' mother suddenly passed away from cancer. That alone was tragic and devastating, but what made it even worse was that she had been a working mom. Her income was a vital part of making ends meet in the Bowen household. As soon as she passed away, Frank wanted to be there for his daughters to help them grieve the loss of their mother, but he couldn't. He had to immediately start picking up late-night shifts at his job just to ensure the family could stay financially stable. Within days of their mother's passing, Frank was out working late, leaving the two grieving girls alone at home. In October of that year, on one of those nights when Tina and Karen were home alone while their dad worked, the girls felt the weight of their loss. They missed their mother desperately and longed for just one more interaction with her. Their world had been turned upside down. As they were putting themselves to bed, they started talking about how much they wished they could communicate with her. At some point, one of the girls had an idea. Maybe there was a way to do that. The girls owned a Ouija board, a tool some believe can be used to speak to the dead. It looks like a game board, with letters, numbers, yes, and no written on it. There's also a small, movable pointer called a planchette. When using the board, people place their fingertips lightly on the planchette and ask questions like, "Are there any spirits here with us?" In theory, spirits can move the planchette to spell out answers, even though the people using it aren't consciously moving it. Excited by the possibility, Tina and Karen decided to try it. They grabbed their Ouija board, went down to the basement, and set it up. They placed their fingers on the planchette and started asking questions. "Mom, are you here with us right now?" Tina asked. They waited, but nothing happened. "Mom, if you're here, please move the planchette. Give us a sign," Karen pleaded. Again, nothing. For over an hour, they sat in the basement, asking every question they could think of, but the planchette never moved. Frustrated and disheartened, they packed up the board and went upstairs to their bedrooms. It felt like another painful reminder that their mother was truly gone. Lying in bed, the house was silent except for the occasional creaks and hums of nighttime. Then, the girls started to hear a faint tapping sound. It seemed to come from somewhere downstairs. At first, they dismissed it as the usual nighttime noises, branches brushing against the house, the hum of appliances, or settling floorboards. But the tapping persisted, growing more irregular yet somehow deliberate. It was clear that this sound wasn't stopping. Karen, feeling increasingly uneasy, left her room and went to Tina's. "Do you hear that tapping sound?" she asked her sister. Tina nodded. "Yeah. What is that?" Together, they stepped into the hallway, the tapping still audible. It seemed to be coming from downstairs. The girls walked to the top of the stairs and peered down into the dark stairwell, but they couldn't see the first floor, only the landing halfway down. The tapping continued. Suddenly, one of the girls whispered, "What if it's Mom? What if the seance worked? What if she's trying to give us a sign?" Excitement replaced their fear. Tina called out, "Mom, is that you down there?" Immediately, there was a response. Tap, tap, tap. The girls froze, then beamed at each other. This was exactly what they'd hoped for during the seance, a sign from their mother. Thrilled, one of them asked, "Mom, if it's really you, can you give us another sign?" Tap, tap, tap. Convinced they were communicating with their mother, the girls began descending the stairs, asking more questions. Despite some of their questions not being simple yes or no ones, the tapping continued to respond. They would always get that sort of tap, tap, tap response, as though something was interacting with them. As they made their way down to the first floor, hearing this tapping and following it around, it eventually brought them to the head of the stairs leading down into the basement. They opened the basement door and started asking more questions, still getting those tapping responses. The sound was clearly coming from downstairs. Even though the girls were excited, convinced it had to be their mom, they weren't confident enough to go down into the basement. Instead, they stopped at the top of the stairs, looking down nervously. "It's got to be Mom," they told each other, but it was still frightening. They stayed there, right above the stairs, looking into the basement while asking questions and getting responses. The sound persisted for 30 to 45 minutes before it finally stopped. The girls kept asking questions, but there was no longer any reaction from the basement. At that point, they felt certain they had been talking to their mom. They were so excited and energized by the experience that they decided to stay awake in the kitchen until their father, Frank, came home from work. When Frank arrived around midnight, he was surprised to see his daughters still awake. The girls rushed to him, bubbling over with excitement. "Dad, you wouldn't believe it. We had a séance, and we heard tapping sounds. It was Mom. She's with us right now. We were talking to her." Frank, though caught off guard, could see how happy his daughters were. He knew they were grieving the loss of their mother, and it broke his heart to think about their pain. Seeing them smile and excited for the first time in so long, he decided not to question what they were saying. "You know what, girls?" Frank said warmly. "Of course, your mom is here. She'll always be with you, looking out for you." The girls were overjoyed by his response. Feeling reassured, they went upstairs to their bedrooms and finally fell asleep. Frank, however, didn't think much of the tapping sounds. He believed it was a coping mechanism his daughters had created to deal with their mother's death. In his mind, it was harmless and even healthy if it made them happy. Over the next few days, the tapping sounds continued. This time, they weren't just coming from the basement. They also seemed to come from the kitchen and the second floor, essentially all over the house. Strangely, the girls were the only ones who could hear them. Every time the girls heard the tapping, they'd call their father, but Frank heard nothing. Still, he chose to play along for their sake. The girls were frustrated by his inability to hear the sounds, but they clung to the belief that it was their mom communicating with them. However, about 3 days after the séance, their feelings began to shift. Initially, the tapping sounds had felt comforting, like a sign of their mother's presence. But now, the sounds were almost exclusively coming from their bedrooms at night. While lying in bed, they'd hear tapping from under their beds or inside their closets. It frightened them. They started calling their dad into their rooms, but he could never find anything. Frank, now worried, started telling his daughters, "There's nothing to be scared of. These are just normal house sounds, or maybe you're overthinking it. Your mom is here, but she's not making those tapping sounds. You need to let it go." The girls, however, insisted, "Dad, we're not making this up. Just because you don't hear it doesn't mean it's not real." Their fear deepened as they began to suspect they hadn't contacted their mom after all. Instead, they believed they had summoned an evil spirit. Frank dismissed the idea. "Come on, girls. There's no such thing. You're just imagining things." The tension between Frank and his daughters grew as they argued about the tapping sounds. The girls became more and more afraid of staying in the house, especially at night. They started finding excuses to stay at friends' houses whenever Frank worked late. After about a week of this, Frank was at his wits' end. What he had initially seen as a harmless coping mechanism had now spiraled into something unhealthy and disruptive. "If you girls can't stop this delusion about the tapping," he warned, "you're going to have to go to grief counseling. This has gone too far." About a week later, the Bowen household had settled into a tense rhythm. On this particular night, the girls, Tina and Karen, were home alone. They had no plans and no friends available to stay with. Their father, Frank, was working a late-night shift, leaving the house eerily quiet. The girls, hanging out in the kitchen, felt a sense of unease. Then, as if on cue, the now familiar tapping sounds began emanating from the basement. By this point, the noise had become a recurring, unsettling mystery. It no longer terrified them outright but left a lingering sense of dread. Tina, the older sister, broke the silence. "Dad doesn't believe us," she said firmly. "He thinks we're making this up. If we don't check this out ourselves, no one ever will." Karen, just 9 years old, was horrified at the idea. The thought of going into the basement filled her with fear, but she didn't want to be left alone either. Reluctantly, she nodded, clutching tightly to Tina's side. Tina grabbed a kitchen knife for protection and opened the basement door. The girls descended cautiously into the dimly lit cellar. The space was barren, save for a washing machine, a dryer, and a few scattered boxes. The air was damp and cold, amplifying their anxiety. As they scanned the room, Tina and Karen expected to find something, an animal or even a logical explanation for the tapping. But there was nothing. No signs of movement, no identifiable source of the sound. The silence was suffocating. "This isn't right," Tina whispered after a few tense minutes. She tightened her grip on the knife. "Let's get out of here." As they turned to climb back upstairs, Karen froze, her eyes wide with terror. "Tina," she stammered, pointing to the wall beside the staircase. There, written in red, were the words, "I'm in your closet. Come find me." The sight sent a wave of horror through the girls. Screaming, they bolted up the stairs, out of the house, and straight to their neighbor's door. They banged frantically until the neighbor answered. "What's going on?" the neighbor asked, alarmed. Through their panic, the girls explained about the seance, the tapping sounds, and now the chilling message on the wall. Though confused, the neighbor ushered them inside, assuring them they were safe and promising to wait for their father's return. When Frank arrived home later that night, the neighbor quickly flagged him down, explaining what the girls had said. Frank listened with a mix of concern and frustration. Leaving the girls at the neighbor's house, he went back home to investigate. He thoroughly searched every corner of the house, including the basement, but found nothing unusual. However, he did see the writing on the wall. The message was scrawled in red ketchup. Shaking his head, Frank returned to the neighbor's house to confront his daughters. He wasn't angry, but he was firm. "I know you wrote that message on the wall," he said. "This has gone too far. I believe this is all grief. You're hurting, and it's manifesting in these ways. Starting tomorrow, you'll both begin grief counseling." The girls, defeated and emotional, didn't argue. Deep down, they knew they hadn't written the message or caused the tapping sounds, but their father's unwavering disbelief left them with no choice. They reluctantly agreed to the counseling. To everyone's surprise, after the girls began therapy, the strange occurrences in the house stopped. The tapping ceased, and the Bowen household returned to a semblance of peace, at least for now. As you may already know, I recently went on tour. My team and I spent 4 weeks traveling across the country in a bus, sharing stories live with thousands of people. It was an incredible and surreal experience. But I've got to say, the best part of the whole adventure was getting to interact with all of you in person, fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious. Almost everyone showed up in flannel. It was like a sea of thousands rocking the flannel because, at this point, it's basically the official uniform of the strange, dark, and mysterious community. Guess what? I have a surprise for you just in time for the holidays. I'm thrilled to announce that our brand new, official Mr. Ballin flannel is now available for purchase at shopmrballin.com. But hurry, quantities are limited, and it's a first-come, first-served situation. And it's not just the flannel. We've launched an entire holiday collection, including the Mr. Ballin Christmas sweater, a hat, a hoodie, a flannel blanket, ornaments, stickers, pins, and much more. But don't wait too long. This is a holiday drop, so if you want these items in time for the holidays, you'll need to order now. Once again, head over to shopmrballin.com to grab your official flannel and other holiday goodies. I can't wait to see you all rocking your flannels on my next tour. Happy holidays, everyone. Fast forward 3 weeks to December 8, 1986. By this time, the Bowen household had enjoyed 3 weeks of total calm. No tapping, no strange occurrences, everything seemed fine. That evening, Frank Bowen, his 2 daughters, Tina and Karen, and their friend Kathleen had been out, maybe getting ice cream or grabbing dinner. When they returned to the house, it was dark outside. Frank walked up to the porch, unlocked the front door, and noticed something odd. Several lights inside the house were on. He didn't remember leaving them on before they left. Puzzled, Frank looked back at the girls, wondering if they had forgotten to turn the lights off. But he shrugged it off, unlocked the door, and pushed it open. Immediately, he was greeted by a bizarre scene. The TV was on, a radio was blaring, and furniture on the first floor had been moved around. Not dramatically, but enough that it was noticeable. Things were out of place. Frank stood frozen, staring at the disarray. He turned to his daughters and wondered if they were behind it. After all, just weeks earlier, they had been writing on walls and insisting there was an evil spirit in the house. Still, he couldn't shake the thought that they had been with him the entire evening. How could they have done this? Caught between disbelief and concern, Frank didn't back out and call the police like most people would. Instead, he started a tentative search of the house. Tina, Karen, and Kathleen followed him closely, terrified. Frank turned off the TV and the radio, repositioned the furniture, and moved through each room on the first floor. He found nothing. Then, he searched the second floor, followed by the attic, and finally the basement. Still, no sign of anyone. Relieved but confused, Frank remembered a small sitting room near the front entrance that he had overlooked. Determined to check every corner of the house, he led the girls back upstairs to the first floor and approached the room. The sitting room overlooked the front yard, with windows facing the road and a small closet to the side. As Frank entered, he immediately noticed something chilling written on the wall in shaving cream, "Marry me." Frank froze, staring at the words. Behind him, the girls clung to his legs, trembling with fear. As he processed what he was seeing, he suddenly heard a noise coming from the closet. Frank turned to face the open, shadowy closet. Before he could react, a man stepped out. He was wearing Frank's deceased wife's dress, had clown makeup smeared across his face, and was holding a hatchet. The man looked at Frank and the terrified girls and growled, "You and the girls, go upstairs." Without hesitation, Frank moved into protective mode. He positioned himself between the intruder and the girls and barked at them, "Go upstairs now." The man, wielding the hatchet, followed closely as Frank shepherded the girls up the stairs. Keeping himself between the intruder and the children, Frank guided them into the first bedroom and hurried them inside. Kathleen, Karen, and Tina were in the house with Frank when chaos unfolded. Frank ran into the bedroom, slamming the door behind him. Standing in the hallway was the maniac, a figure wearing a dress, clown makeup, and wielding a hatchet. The maniac lunged at the door, and Frank held it shut, struggling desperately to keep him out. Tina, already inside the bedroom, panicked. Without hesitation, she sprinted toward the window and leaped out from the second floor. She hit the ground hard but managed to get up and race to the neighbor's house. Slamming her fists on their door, she screamed, "There's someone in my house." The neighbor, alarmed by Tina's frantic state, immediately called the police. Minutes later, officers arrived at the Bowen residence. Frank leaned out of the second-floor window, shouting, "He's in here. He was at my door but disappeared. I don't know where he went." The police quickly set up a ladder to help Frank and the girls safely exit the house. Once everyone was secure at the neighbor's home, the officers entered the Bowen house, weapons drawn. They searched every room, corner, and crevice, but found nothing. The house was empty. However, by the back sliding glass door, they discovered a hatchet lying on the floor, with the door partially open. Concluding that the intruder must have escaped through there, the police informed Frank and his family. "We didn't see anyone," they explained, "but we'll monitor your property 24/7 and launch an investigation. In the meantime, it's best you and your family stay somewhere else." Frank and his daughters moved to a family friend's house. For 2 days, the police surveilled the Bowen property, but nothing suspicious occurred. Their investigation into the maniac, described as a man in a dress with clown makeup, yielded no leads. After 2 days, Frank decided to retrieve some belongings from his house. He assured the girls that he'd be quick and headed there alone in broad daylight. Expecting to see an officer outside the property, he was surprised to find no one. Strange, he thought. Shrugging it off, he approached the front door. Out of the corner of his eye, he thought he saw movement on the second floor. When he looked up, the window was still. Are the police inside the house? He wondered. Concerned, he walked to the neighbor's house and used their phone to call the station. "Are your officers inside my house?" he asked. "No," they replied. "We monitor from the outside. What you're seeing is likely a coincidence, perhaps a shift change between officers." Relieved but cautious, Frank hung up and returned to his house. This time, he saw a police car parked outside. Approaching the officer, Frank explained the situation. "No one's been in or out of your house," the officer assured him. "But just to be safe, I'll check it for you." Frank waited nervously at the neighbor's house while the officer entered his home. Moments later, the officer stepped inside and was met with a scene of utter chaos on the first floor. There are pennies glued to the ceiling of the first floor, and the furniture has clearly been moved all over the place, but it's been stacked in these weird arrangements. There are glasses of champagne all over the first floor, and kitchen knives have been driven into family photos on the wall. The knives are still sticking into the photos, and where they've been driven through the pictures, it's always on a photo of either Tina or Karen, the two daughters. Above these pictures, where the knives are stuck, are written words, "I'm going to kill you, Tina," or "I'm going to kill you, Karen." The officer, obviously recognizing the seriousness of the situation, realizes there is a problem here. He backs out of the house and calls for reinforcements. Soon, all the officers enter with guns drawn, now convinced that someone has either found a way in and out of the house or is still there. They believe they have to find and deal with this maniac that the Bowens encountered on the second floor when police first arrived. Clearly, the Bowens weren't lying, and someone else is responsible for the mess they're seeing. The police tear the Bowen household apart, looking for this maniac. They search everywhere, but they can't find anyone. It had snowed outside, and before entering the house, they checked around the property for any footprints coming in or out. There were none. It's not possible, but they've now destroyed the house, looking for something or someone. They found nothing other than the chaos, the moved furniture, the writing, the knives, that's all. Hours of frustrating searching pass, and a few officers find themselves in the basement. They're standing there, talking to each other, wondering what they've missed. At some point, one of them has his hand resting on the washing machine, casually speaking, when, suddenly, the washing machine moves. This shift creates a gap in the wall where the machine was previously sitting. The officer looks at the wall and notices a hole. He gets out his flashlight, scans the hole, and sees a tunnel that's been burrowed into the wall. The tunnel leads to the corner. When the officer looks back into the hole, he sees Danny Lant crouched down. He has a hatchet over his shoulder and is wearing a dress. He stares back at the officer. Let me tell you about Danny Lant because this story takes a very dark turn. Danny Lant was 16 years old when he was pulled out of the Bowen household's wall. 6 months earlier, he had a brief interaction with Tina Bowen, who was 15 at the time. They may have gone to school together or had some sort of interaction in town, but Danny had developed a romantic interest in Tina, which he felt was rejected. Tina, however, didn't remember any of this with Danny. This was all Danny's memory of the event. Regardless, Danny's response to this perceived rejection was to break into the Bowen household, cut a hole in their walls, and burrow tunnels in their basement. For 6 months, Danny Lant lived inside the walls of the Bowen household. Danny couldn't access the entire house through the wall in the basement. He could only move around in the basement and part of the first floor. To get to other parts of the house, Danny had to leave the wall. So, routinely, for 6 months, while the family was home, Danny would sneak out of the wall and wander through their house. The family never noticed him. Danny spied on them 24/7, and when the girls held a séance with a Ouija board to try to contact their mother, Danny was in the basement, in the walls, watching. He saw an opportunity and decided to pretend to be their mother. He began tapping on the walls to convince them their mother had returned. When Frank, the father, was around, Danny would stop tapping to make him think the girls were just imagining things. Over time, Danny transitioned from pretending to be their mom to actively trying to terrify the girls. He began tapping at all hours of the night, sneaking out of the walls to the girls' bedroom, flicking the underside of their beds, and even hiding in their closet, tapping from there. He made sure to escape before Frank entered, all while being completely hidden. This behavior was absolutely psychotic. Eventually, Danny was arrested, but 10 months later, while awaiting trial, he was released on bail. While out on bail, he snuck into another family's home in Massachusetts, the Gustafson house. Sadly, that family did not escape Danny's wrath. He murdered 3 members of that family for no particular reason. He just picked them and killed them. It's likely that, had Tina not jumped out of the second-floor window when Danny revealed himself in a dress, holding a hatchet, and urged the family to go up to the bedroom, things would have gone far worse. Tina saved their lives when she leapt out and Frank held the door off. Danny was likely planning to trap the family in that room and kill them. As of the time of this video, Danny Lant is still alive and serving multiple consecutive life sentences. He was recently put up for parole but was denied. During his parole hearing, He was determined to be one of the most psychopathic inmates in the entire prison system. Now, here is a clip from the latest episode of Redacted. On June 7, 1998, CNN News Group CEO Tom Johnson sat at his desk in his corner office, overlooking the massive newsroom in Midtown Atlanta. Below him, the workspace buzzed with energy as journalists darted between desks, and banks of monitors flickered with breaking news reports. Johnson was in his element, loving his job. He was known as a no-nonsense leader and was well respected by his team. In the nearly 20 years since CNN first launched, the 24-hour cable network had become the most influential source in television news. It changed the landscape for how people learned about breaking news, with correspondents all over the world ready to report at a moment's notice. It was Johnson's job to build on CNN's dominance and drive up the ratings. Johnson turned when he heard a tap on his door. The secretary rushed in and said he had a call from a retired general, who was CNN's military analyst. She warned him that the general sounded annoyed, but Johnson was used to putting out fires and dealing with people who were upset, so his secretary's warning didn't alarm him. As soon as Johnson picked up the phone, the general's bristling tone made it clear he was outraged. He told the CEO he'd received some disturbing news. The general had been informed that a segment about a covert military operation in Southeast Asia was scheduled to air on CNN the next night. Apparently, this report contained wild allegations about the U.S. military gassing villages, killing American soldiers, and even innocent civilians. Johnson tried to respond but couldn't get a word in. The general railed that neither he nor CNN's other top military analyst had been consulted about such a damning report. Johnson took a deep breath and said that the general was right. They did plan to air a segment tomorrow night about a covert military operation during the Vietnam War. It was the first episode of a new show called CNN News An, a collaboration with Time magazine. Johnson assured him the story had taken almost a year of careful investigative journalism. But nothing Johnson said deterred the general. He insisted they pull the show. Johnson wasn't about to back down. Too much work had gone into the episode about a secret military operation called Operation Tailwind. Besides, CNN had already been promoting it heavily. It was simply too late to pull. There was silence on the other end. Then, the general spoke in an ominous tone. He told Johnson he was about to make the biggest mistake in the history of CNN. Johnson stood his ground. He ended the call by saying that the story was going to be a bombshell. Johnson would be right, but the story would explode in a way he never saw coming.